Around the World with Douglas Murray. Uncommon Knowledge now. Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge, filming today in Fiesole, Italy. I'm Peter Robinson. Educated at Eton and Magdalen College, Oxford, Douglas Murray is a journalist based in New York. His books include the bestsellers The Strange Death of Europe and The Madness of Crowds. Earlier this year, I should say, he spent a month in Ukraine and 6 months in Israel. Douglas, thank you for joining me.
Pleasure to be with you.
6 months in Israel, let's begin there. What surprised you most?
I suppose two things stand out. I got to Israel as soon as I could after the atrocities of the 7th of October. Spent the next 6 months there. I suppose one thing about the terrorists and one about the victims. About the terrorists, I would say that although I've covered quite a lot of conflicts and seen quite a lot of human evil, what the Hamas terrorists did on the 7th of October was a level of depravity which shocked me.
How many died? Remind me.
It was 1,200 people were murdered on the day. More than 300 taken hostage into Gaza. When I say the level of depravity, it's partly the fact that not just the atrocities they committed, I mean, the kibbutz, the villages, the communities on the Gaza border, and at the Nova party where hundreds of young people were murdered. There's something about, I've seen all the atrocity videos, not just the 47-minute video that I saw pretty soon after, but a lot of people have shared with me other things that are unpublishable, unbroadcastable. And I've heard a lot of testimony from survivors and others. And I think that apart from the sheer physical violence and barbarism, the rapes, the shooting women in the genitals at the party, the beheadings, the cutting off people's heads with a cleaver and so on. I think aside from that, the thing that struck me is that they were proud of what they were doing. Now that is something that an awful lot of people have done an awful lot of evil things. I've very rarely seen one so proud of their evil as they're carrying it out. The terrorists of the 7th broadcast, GoPro videoed a lot of what they did, and they were high on evil. I mean, some people have heard the tape probably of the young terrorist who calls his parents in Gaza and says, Father, I've killed 10 Jews with my own hands. Get mother on the phone. I think it's hard to think of many cases in history where people actually not just carried out atrocities like that, but absolutely jubilant about them. There are 2 boys whose father was killed in front of them in their safe room, and one of the boys lost his ear and the other an eye, and they were staggering around the room. And the terrorist who just killed their father comes in and takes food out of their fridge. And one of the boys says to the terrorist, "That's my mother's food." And the terrorist said, "Where's your mother? I want her too." So a level of evil which is something that has to be thought about and of course dealt with. I suppose the second thing I'd say is the remarkable response of the Israeli public. Israel isn't like Britain or America. Its threats are awfully close. Maybe always were. But the first responders, the people caught up in it in the day, were not just victims, but a lot of them were extraordinary heroes. I'm thinking of people who dropped everything, drove south, picked up some guns, and fought for the next 48 hours. A friend of mine who left a farewell message to his wife and his 2 children on the way south, because he was sure he wouldn't survive. And he saved a lot of lives. People of all ages, and indeed all backgrounds. The Muslim doctor I've spoken to who was personally held as a human shield by Hamas, and who saved lives. I think of the Druze men I spoke with who were at the parties serving food and who managed, because they could understand the Arabic, they could overhear exactly what was happening. They're remarkable men. And the country is filled, in my view, with remarkable people. So those are the two things that stand out most. I've been in Gaza a fair amount and seen the response of the IDF and the attempt to get back the hostages and to capture or kill all the heads of Hamas. And I've watched the world lose sympathy with Israel, but they lost sympathy from about day one.
All right. I want to come back to that. You've answered the question about the moral calculus over and over and over again, but I must ask the question because it is a mandatory question. If the Israelis lost 1,200, what is the number at which they really may not pursue the war any further? It feels in the response to Israel, let's put it this way, the international response with the ICC, the International Criminal Court, naming charges against Benny Gantz and the Prime Minister Netanyahu for atrocities. I don't know what the numbers actually are because the press, oddly enough, unreflectively, unchallengingly, seems to be giving us Hamas laundered numbers for the number. But it's thousands of people who've been killed in Gaza who are civilians rather than Hamas. All right, just state it one more time, the moral calculus.
Well, the first thing is I refute the idea that war that is started by an enemy like Hamas can only be responded to a certain level of casualties.
All right.
I refute the idea. I don't think it's something which Britain or America has been expected to abide by in our past. I don't think it's something we've been expected to abide by in our present. Not many years ago, when we helped to flatten most of Mosul in order to get Islamic State out of Mosul, the French, British, and American forces involved did not worry about the number of casualties, and nobody counted the casualties.
Right.
We do not know to this day how many people were killed in Mosul or northern Iraq and the borders of Syria to get ISIS. We simply wanted to get them because they'd carried out the Bataclan massacre and much more. Only Israel seems to be expected to act by this strange standard of what's often called proportionality. I like to think I shot down that idea at the beginning of the war when a journalist asked me about that, before Israel had even done anything. And I said, you know, if you believe in this idea of proportionality, it means that the IDF should be allowed to go into Gaza and kill precisely the number of children that Hamas killed and rape precisely the number of women that Hamas raped, and so on. Would that be acceptable? No. Would the Israelis abide by such a grotesque idea? Of course not. What then is the acceptable calculus? As you say, most of the international media have been relying on Hamas figures. There's a reason for that, by the way, which is that no Western media are in Gaza.
All right, we'll come to that as
They're
well.
not in there. They lie to their viewers. They fib. They cover up for their own journalistic failings. It's not even a failing. I don't blame a lot of them.
So let's come to that right now. Why is the reporting so, it runs from thin to biased to non-existent? I think back to the Iraq War, when we went into Iraq, John Burns, the great journalist, wrote from the New York Times. He was on the ground, he was writing, it was military reporting. You understood, any reader of the Times understood the objectives, understood the progress week by week by week. No such journalism exists. Yeah. Why?
Well, there's only two ways to be in Gaza. One is to be embedded with the IDF, as I've been, and the other is to have the permission of Hamas. Hamas are not very good hosts, and they're untrustworthy hosts. And so most of the Western media rely on journalists who are Gazans, all of whom are operating under Hamas restrictions at best, and most of whom are going to be Hamas supporters. And Hamas, as a result, has got out its figures. It came out with this figure of 30,000 people some months ago, and then they said that this was a number of casualties. They produced no evidence for it, and the world just repeated this figure. That figure, by the way, has been halved.
Has it?
Yeah. In the last few weeks, more official figures, better figures have come out from a range of sources, which say that the 30,000 figure was never true. But anyway, if you follow the IDF's figures on the number of Hamas terrorists that they've killed inside Gaza and the number of innocent civilians killed, if you take even the Hamas figures, you're dealing with roughly, and this is a horrible calculus, but this is war, you're dealing with roughly one terrorist killed to one civilian. America in the field in Afghanistan managed something like 1 terrorist to 3 or 4 civilians.
Right.
We don't really know. In Fallujah, how did we do? Not as well as the Israelis.
But
so that bears lingering on for a second. But the second thing is that the reporting, as I've seen too many times now, the reporting is so ignorant because people repeat what Hamas has said within seconds. Near the beginning of the conflict, there's a place called the Shifa. It's sometimes called the Shifa Hospital. It should be better known as the Shifa Hamas Command Headquarters. It's a place we know from video footage, CCTV. They took some of the hostages on the 7th, and they didn't take them to the Shifa Hospital to treat them. The Shifa had a rocket land in its car park some months ago. And Hamas immediately announced that it was an Israeli rocket that had hit the hospital and killed 500 people. Note, by the way, that the Israelis took months to work out the exact number of figures from the 7th of October who've been killed in Israel, because it's extremely hard. I've been to the morgues. I've seen the bodies. I've seen the charred remains. It takes a long time to work out who's dead in a burned-out house. Magically, Hamas can do it like that and can come up with a round figure. Oh, but after the world has said that the Israelis fired a rocket at a hospital and killed 500 people, after some time, sure as anything, we discover the rocket was an Islamic Jihad rocket fired from inside Gaza, which landed in the car park of the Shifa compound and may have killed some people, not 500. This is the day in, day out reality of reporting on that conflict. Just before we're sitting here, the Israeli Defense Forces are in Rafah, operating in unbelievably complicated situations, very, very intense fighting, to get the last remaining hostages out and to find Sinwar, the architect of the 7th, who's almost certainly hiding in the tunnels under Rafah. Just before we're sitting here, there's an outrage around the world claiming that the Israelis have been indiscriminately bombing a tent encampment of Palestinians. Now, already, after that lie has gone around the world, we discover what happened was that just yesterday or the day before, Hamas fired rockets from between the tents in one of the civilian areas, and they fired them at Tel Aviv. Now the Israelis located the launch pads, and they fired. And it seems that what happened was that a munition of Hamas arms exploded as a secondary explosion. Now, whose fault is that? All of these deaths are, in my mind, very clearly the fault of Hamas. There is a cost to starting a war. And there is no law of war that I know of that says you're allowed to start a war and massacre civilians in their homes, and then, when you start to lose the war you started, say this is unfair. We would accept this under no other situation, in no other circumstances. But it's the Jews, so it's different.
So, from what you saw in Israel to American campuses, we had a congressional hearing with the president of Harvard, the president of Penn, the president of MIT, and all three of them refused to say in any simple, straightforward, forthright way, all moral codes prohibit advocating genocide. Exactly. All right, we have that. We have pro-Palestine from the river to the sea is the chant. Demonstrations and encampments on one elite campus after another. What on earth is going on?
Let me do this in the briefest way I can. The people who are currently at encampments in support of Hamas, which is what it is, I've seen those things. I've heard what they say. They're for Hamas. Even I, with my often jaded glance at the disintegration of thought in the West, was slightly surprised at the speed with which adults on American campuses were able to rush straight into the arms of Hamas. But fine, there they are. I would put out this question. I suspect you'd agree with me, Peter, that the women in particular protesting there on these campuses, probably a few years ago, were holding up signs that said, "Believe all women." Do you remember "Believe all women"?
I remember that.
Wow, "Believe all women" turns out to have a border turns out to have a cordon around it. It turns out to have an exception. It has a subclause. The subclause is, except Jewish women. Some of those students, 10 years ago maybe, when was it, 2014, Chibok schoolgirls were stolen from northern Nigeria, where I've also been. And Hollywood celebrities, students, Michelle Obama, bring back our girls. Hashtag, bring back our girls. Tell me where the demonstration has been, anywhere in America, from the campuses to Hollywood. Bring back our Jewish children. There's a reason there is no such hashtag. There's a reason why there is no such campaign. Jews don't count. Not in the eyes of these perverted minds on American campuses. Now, they don't know that they're bigots. And they may not know that they're racists. But we've been here before, many times. A lot of people don't mean to be evil. They don't mean to support evil, but they support evil. And that's what the students at Columbia and endless numbers of other universities across America have been doing.
All right, so it looks to me, this is a very rough cut, I'm just telling you, I'm speaking now just as somebody who reads the newspapers and looks at the news. Presidents of universities and boards of trustees have figured out how to respond, or figured out at least that they must respond. So now encampments are being rolled up, or they're being very tightly limited. We have here's an example. We have at the University of Texas, there was some sort of protest. The president of the University of Texas let it go on very briefly. They were in violation of university rules. He called in the police and had it ended. With what result? That more than 700 members of the faculty of the University of Texas signed a statement protesting this brutal treatment of students. Dartmouth College, where there's a new president, I follow that situation closely because I went to Dartmouth. The new president gets a protest on the Green in Hanover. The protesters are in violation of college rules. The president has the police come in and take the protesters away. The president receives a vote of censure from the faculty of Dartmouth College, the first time any president in the more than 2-century history of Dartmouth College has ever been censured. So what I'm saying is it feels as though the kids will get sorted out sooner or later by reality, the job market, their parents. Presidents and boards understand the need to respond. But you've got embedded faculties, large proportions of whom are well, of course, and because of tenure, they're just there to stay. But what I don't understand is, what is the intellectual transmission belt here? How do you go from the senior members of faculties on the great universities today are people who trained in the 60s. How do you go from anti-Vietnam War to pro-Hamas? What is the intellectual progression that gets you from there to there?
I mean, there's an intellectual explanation. There's just also an obvious moral one. The intellectual one is that a lot of these people think their job is to educate students into becoming radicals.
I see. All right.
Now, a lot of American, I mean, I would like clearing out of American academia to such an extent that the job market would be unavailable to them in future. A lot of these people have nothing to add. They've never had anything to add. They teach grievance studies. And I always hoped, like a lot of people of my inclination, that these people would discover, the graduates would discover that there were no jobs for them after learning how to be bitter and stupid at the cost of about $60,000 a year. But the faculty encourage them with the idea that, first of all, their opinions matter, and secondly, that they're informed. I will say this as strongly as I can. These students are narcissists of the worst kind, because they're not just narcissists, but they're ignoramus narcissists. Who thinks that the Israeli war cabinet, after a massacre of its people, should alter its war policy because of a bunch of ignoramuses in Colombia who've never seen a war and never lost someone in a war? Why would any government alter its war plan and get its generals to stop its war to get its hostages back because of some students at Berkeley? It's preposterous. What do they think they're doing? Who do they think is listening to them? Why do they think they're important? Do they know how to clear house to house in Rafah? Do they have any idea how to get the remaining hostages back without any civilian casualties? Are they able to clear large areas of ground with a tunnel network wider than the London Underground? Do they know how to find tunnel shafts? Do they know how to discern the difference between a tunnel shaft which is booby-trapped and one which is not? None of these things. They've thought of none of them. So that's the narcissism thing and the ignorance thing. But the evil thing is that instead of being some banal peacenik saying something like, why can't they just have peace? Right. Say, brilliant insight, brilliant, no Israeli ever thought of that. Instead of that, they actually run all the way to supporting evil. But we've seen this before, Peter. We saw this in the 60s. We saw it in the 70s. There were previous generations of people in Germany, across Europe, and in America, who had one idea of what not to be. Don't be a Nazi.
Yes.
Right. That was their one political philosophy after 1945. And it's not a bad place to start. Not a bad place to start. Don't be a Nazi. These people even now call themselves quite often anti-Nazis, anti-fascists. Well, in the 70s and the 60s, a lot of the people who orientated themselves that way, and that way alone, found themselves, for instance, supporting the PLO, the PLA, the PFLP, even when they were hijacking planes. And some of the people, very interesting book about this by Paul Berman, some of the people involved in that, whose one orientation had been, don't let's be Nazis, let's do what our parents did in Germany, ended up separating Jews from non-Jews on hijacked planes. So when these students today at American campuses who believe they're anti-fascist, they believe they're anti-racist, this is their one idea, and they behave as if it's an extraordinary idea and available only to them. When they decide that in order to be anti-Nazi and anti-oppressor and anti-white colonialist and much more, end up supporting or covering for or trying to ignore the rape and massacre of Jews, they're the Nazis. They're the Nazis.